Well, it's about 4 minutes after the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We will let people in as they come on, and want to respect your time and thank you again for being here. My name is Marna Anderson. I'm the director of Nonviolent Peaceforce in the United States. I've been with Nonviolent Peaceforce for about 7 years, and it just gets more and more interesting, and I get more heart for this organization the longer I do it. And one of the reasons it brings me in contact with people like you and so many others who are really working for peace around the world, and it's just a huge gift. So I want to thank Nonviolent Peaceforce and the other organizations that help bring this together, World Without War, and to talk about how we can reimagine safety and security. So at Nonviolent Peaceforce, we work in the areas most impacted by armed conflict by working alongside communities to interrupt and prevent violence. Nonviolent Peaceforce champions unarmed civilian protection, which is a methodology and set of practices for the direct physical protection of civilians. Our folks are trained unarmed civilians, and they work before, during, and after violent conflict. UCP is grounded in civilian agency and action that prioritizes leadership and decision-making by communities themselves, working alongside other unarmed actors such as civil society groups. In this way, UCP creates security in the near term, also transforming conflict into the future. I'm really proud to host this conversation today as Peace Science Digest launches their latest special issue in collaboration with Nonviolent Peaceforce. The Peace Science Digest is designed to lower barriers of access to academic knowledge in peace science by selecting articles from peer-reviewed academic journals and summarizing their main findings in more accessible language. The editorial team pulls out broader implications and practical relevance in each analysis. The Peace Science Digest is a tool to usher in change. It makes peace science accessible, understandable, and useful. This issue focuses on nonviolent civilian-led strategies for protection and violence prevention in various violent contexts, ranging from civil war and intercommunal violent conflict to urban gun violence. Drawing attention to these nonviolent approaches to security provision provides a critical response to the question, if not military intervention or militarized policing when civilians are being threatened by violence, then what? What's the answer? But we aren't starting from scratch. The answers are already rooted in communities. To answer these questions and help us think through, then what, we have examples, a few people to give examples of their own work. And today we're joined by my colleague, Sunday Stephen, who is a protection officer with Nonviolent Peaceforce in Juba, South Sudan. Ryan Nakade, who's a mediator, facilitator, and consultant for Cure-PDX project in the Pacific Northwest. And Juan Camilo, executive director of Fundación Alvaralice in Cali, Colombia. So from the range of organizations, communities, and contexts, my hope is that the story Sunday, Ryan, and Juan share today will give you a window into how we might retrieve security from militarism and ground it in relationships that are rooted in relationships instead of fear. So for our first speaker, it's my pleasure again to introduce my colleague, Sunday Stephen. Sunday has works in Juba. She's been with Nonviolent Peaceforce for the last 4 years. And Sunday, I'd like to start off with you, if that's okay. We've talked about how strong relationships are so critical to keeping each other safe, and that's really the root of the work of Nonviolent Peaceforce. But I'm hoping you can let us know what that actually looks like in practice in your work.
Okay, thank you once again. I'm Sunday Stephen from Juba, South Sudan. I hope many know about Juba and also South Sudan as well. It's a very small country which is also new. I believe across the world, many of people will not know about what South Sudan is, but slowly you'll know about it, how it's South Sudan and how people work here in South Sudan. I'd like to start straight away with the UCP and how we work here in the ground. Am I clear?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, yeah. We are in South Sudan as working for Nonviolent Peaceforce for the last 4 years. We have 14 field sites here in South Sudan, which it happened I'm working in one field site, Juba IDP camps, which was recently, because before it was POC, but now it's become an IDP camp due to the transitions which is going on. I work closely with women protection teams and youth protection team, which we call WPTs and YPT. And I'd like to talk a little bit about when was the time when the WPTs and YPT established. That was in 2014, February, right away after the conflict that started in South Sudan in December 2013. So from that time, Nonviolent starts to operate within the IDP camp and come up with the idea of creating these groups of WPTs and YPT, which are the women protection teams and youth protection teams. So the aim of this group was to help in awareness raising session, help also in the relationship building with the stakeholders, as long as with the other NGOs, and do the advocacy for their communities and help in raising awareness on human rights violation and how human rights can be taken as important as it is. In the field site that I'm working in, the population is 51,300 individuals, in which 37,800 are registered people, and we have also unregistered people to make the total of 51,300. And within this, we have around 260 WPTs, which are the women protection teams, and we have around 100 YPT, which are the youth protection team. So with the core values of UCP, which make these groups be strong. So one of the things is non-partisanship and non-violence. So when they are taking these two values as in they are increasing their work in the community, because they're involved in awareness raising, they're involved in relationship building, they're involved in decision making within the communities that they're in, and the principle of nonviolence, which are the core principle of UCP, help them to move on with their work and also build the trust that community wants from them. And not forgetting also the primacy of local actors, which it's really important in where we are, because the stakeholders have more decision than those who are just as civilians under them. And these are the only people that have a decision making within the community. So YPT and the WPTs are building a strong relationship with these groups, despite the fact that they keep on changing every 6 months, but WPTs and the YPT never give up on introducing themselves to them, building that relationship with them, letting them also know about the importance of how people can stay in peace without doing violence in the community. So this brings me to how WPTs are carrying out their activities and how it's been successful together with the help of the other communities. WPTs are doing what's so-called peer-to-peer education. So peer-to-peer education is being done by the WPT as well as YPT. This one helps them to move in groups and also talk to different groups at different time by targeting them differently, and then also get their views on how people can move forward with safety instead of being in a violence environment. And we also saw it as something that was working and it's really changed a lot of stories with people that many people become more of they wanted to talk rather than being violent or maybe creating some problems within themselves. And it also helped in social cohesion because we have 64 tribes within the country, and it's making it hard when people want to communicate to themselves or maybe come closer and discuss some issues. But when they do peer-to-peer education, it's become more clear to everybody, and it also create more platform for women as well as for youth to voice out what is really paining them or what is really a challenge to their life, and they all sit together and discuss the way forward. So another thing also, the WPTs and YPT, they look to be a role model in the community with the life that the taking people into and how their life have changed after them joining the groups, and also after them knowing about UCP, how their life have changed. Because in this society and also the setting of South Sudan, many people have experienced so many violations, so many wars since people have been together in Sudan before separation. So a lot of things have been happening, and many people that were in the violent and hostile places. So seeing how UCP worked, it made everybody to be interested to join because they have tried all means of to do the protection, but it didn't work for them. And they also see that it's creating more conflicts among themselves when they are also armed, or maybe when they are also being violent to one another, which also makes them to be a good role model in the community and also convince community how UCP is really important than being violent or than being armed, because they have this ideology that when you are armed, when you have knife, when you have spears, when you have gun, this is when you are more safer. But also another way around, WPTs and the YPT that are really implementing UCP without them having all this, and they manage to rescue people from fighting. They manage to bring people together, sit and dialogue instead of fighting, which they see UCP is more stronger than when you are having a gun. Because when you have a gun or when you have a weapon, you just scare people, not convincing them, or maybe not giving them that platform to talk about what it's going through and what is going, like, how do they feel about their life and how can they change it. But with UCP, it's really making things easier that people come together and discuss their differences. With that, also they're doing our outreach awareness, which also helps them to reach out to different people within the community. And how this awareness raising has been effective is that there is acceptances in the community. Seeing the WPTs, they are the members from the community, but how they are also preaching this UCP, it's totally a different idea from what they have been having before in their life, which also make it interested for them to pay much attention to these groups. And also once like whenever they carry out a community outreach, is more interested that many people do like to join the groups, and they keep on adding more people every day. They carry out these activities because everybody feel, okay, it's good that I can be sitting and get more information about how I can live my life than being violent, because a violent can never take me anywhere. And in I can give a story of an old man. One time I was in that awareness actually, and then he was like, we tried hard to be good people and to bring peace, but we couldn't manage it because what we were using, we thought it was more good than how you can talk to the person, because people believe that when you just take a step of talking to somebody, they will say you are cowards. They'll say you are just fearing to die. You're not a man. And how the perception of the community about men, they have to be violent. They don't have to be soft to whoever is there, because they do believe that they are created strong. But it come and say that I realize all this time what I've been doing is something that has no sense. Rather than if I can sit down and discuss something with my family or with my neighbors is giving more benefit than fighting the other person, because I will be hurt and I will also hurt the other person, which I don't want to. But with the hunger and how I'm brought up, so I was told to do so. This is how UCP is really working in the ground. And with all these stories, with the relationship building, we also found that the WPTs and YPT actually acknowledge how important it can be. And some of them are currently wishing for their children, for their families to be aware of how they can be using the UCP. And about 50 women, they have already trained their husbands, their partners on how UCP is really important. And they also want them to be a role model in the community and also help the other communities who are not having this knowledge and pass the knowledge to the entire community of South Sudan. So within these 14 field sites of South Sudan, we've been seeing a great impact that people are really changing and people are really getting adopted to the UCP and how the relationship building have been working with all the staffs of Nonviolent, including also the women protection teams and the white protection, the youth protection teams. So after here, I think I can stop. And if there's something I forgot later, I will also like to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunday. And I forgot to mention that we will have time for questions afterwards. And so you can put your question in the chat and we will get to those when our speakers are done. I would like to next introduce Ryan. And Ryan received his training in mediation and facilitation from East County Resolutions in Gresham, Oregon. He currently works as a facilitator for the Department of Human Services Family Decision Cases. He is part of Cure-PDX project, where he focuses on outreach to rural conservative communities to counter polarization and violent extremism. And he also facilitates for Civic Synergy, which brings college students of diverging political backgrounds together to formulate bipartisan policy solutions that are proposed to members of Congress. So Ryan, we'd like to start off and talk with you about, in your experience and work, what drives violent extremism and how can community members help address, overcome, and prevent it?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Marna. It's great to be here. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that I do in countering violent extremism in the Pacific Northwest with the Cure-PDX project. And my lens and background as a mediator, I'm very interested in the state of hyperpolarization that we're now facing as a country that I'm sure many of you, especially in the US, are familiar with or have experienced, right? Where it feels like the political and ideological divide and the gap between different sides has gotten so large that we might be on the brink of what some people have been calling a cold civil war, or as my friend Rich, who's here today, calls cultural trench warfare, right? And so there's a very destructive dynamic is emerging between this feedback loop of hyperpolarization, where we balkanize into different kind of ideological silos, and then we tend to otherize and dehumanize each other or people on the other side. And that kind of feeds extremism, right? People feel more radicalized to graft onto an extremist ideology. The contents of that ideology might further work to dehumanize and otherize people of different sides. And so as this kind of shape of society starts to crystallize, right, we have people who are totally entrenched on one side, who are otherizing each other, and it becomes so easy for the narrative of violence or condoning violence or not condemning violence to become the norm, right? It's so easy to normalize violence against the other side when you have no contact with them and your ideological lens completely dehumanizes them, right? And so being a mediator and facilitator, I've always had a lot of interest in bringing different sides together, coming to the table, talking with each other, humanizing each other, et cetera. And I quickly found the limitations of those approaches, even though I do believe they have a lot of value. There's an organization called Braver Angels, and they bring reds and blues, right, liberals and conservatives together for civil and productive, constructive dialogue. And I think those movements are doing a lot of great work. But of course, they tend to self-select for a certain type of person, namely people who are already interested in bridging the divides, might already have an interest in working with the other side. And so you basically end up preaching to the converted and self-selecting for people who don't need depolarization or de-escalation as much. So I said, well, how do I reach people who need it the most, right? Who won't voluntarily come to the table for discussion. So I said, you know what? I think I'm gonna be a cultural ambassador. Okay, I live in a small town in rural Washington. I live in a town called Toledo. It's about 500 people. And so I kind of took it on myself for the Cure-PDX project to go to diverse communities, diverse ideological communities, and to talk to people. And my mantra is on their own terms, on their own turf. And so part of the model that we use at Cure-PDX is to reach out to networks of credible messengers and community leaders who have the authority and standing in their respective communities so that they can detect and interrupt potential violence, because the members of their community who might be radicalizing to violence already trust these community leaders and credible messengers. So if we can build relationships with them, if we can find them, maybe give them some resources, give them some tools, coach them a little bit, and help them to interrupt the violence in their respective communities. And so I decided to do this by going to a whole bunch of different events. And so I'll just give you some examples of different communities that I've met with. So I've been talking to evangelical pro-life activists, conservative Baptist pastors, members of QAnon or supporters of QAnon. I've gone to Trump-backed political candidates, political rallies when candidates were running for office in Washington, different kind of moderate conservative groups, and also right-wing anarchist and anarcho-capitalist groups and communities. And so a lot of this was in person. So I would just basically tell my wife, hey, I'm going to go drive to this event. If you don't hear from me by 7 o'clock, call the police. So I would just go and drive off, meet with people, talk to people, make friends, get some phone numbers, follow up, have dinner, have breakfast, go to their house, that kind of thing. And then I did some online engagement and kind of talking to communities online to build these relationships and find these credible messengers. And so several things I'm really vigilant of when I do this kind of work. So one is first starting with myself and looking at my own biases, right? And one thing I've noticed is there's a problem where, even if people have the intention of building a relationship, and we live in such a sensitive, polarized climate, it can be very easy to, quote unquote, ideologically microaggress someone, right? You might say something in a certain way that's offensive or off-putting or accidentally otherizing to someone of a certain side. And so I'm always looking at my own self and my own biases, my own political biases, my own ideological leanings, and making sure that I can talk to people on their own terms and on their own turf and amplify the narratives that build peace in their respective communities. And so just as an example, I went to a evangelical Christian apologetics conference in Olympia, Washington, and they were constantly quoting, I think it was 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." Right? So they're emphasizing the gentleness and respect and that narrative in their community. And so it's about kind of uplifting and nourishing the narratives that promote peace, nonviolence, and civility in their respective communities, but using their own kind of ideological language or the language that already resonates with that community. And another example was talking to some people on QAnon, and we were talking about conspiracy theories, we were talking about elites and those kind of things. And I was saying that, there's this narrative that the elites want the people to be divided, right? Divided against themselves. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, well, what is the role of, civil dialogue and bridging and depolarization in that? And he said, yeah, I think I have to, kind of look at myself and not be as inflammatory and be patient and kind with people that I disagree with. Because the more I fight with other people, the more the people are divided against each other. I'm kind of feeding into the elite's agenda, right? So everyone has their own unique path to getting to a kind of non-violent and anti-polarizing approach. Even if we ideologically disagree with the content or the context in which people get there, they still have their own way of getting there. right? So another thing I look at a lot when I work with different communities are the natural incentives already in those communities. How are people already incentivized or motivated to promote nonviolence, interrupt violent narratives and behaviors, and help their communities in this kind of way? And so one example would be a lot of the pro-life activists who I've been working with have been very galvanized, especially since the Roe decision. And they have a lot of interest in working with other conservative churches to get members of these churches to show up at like pro-life events or to protest outside of Planned Parenthood, or et cetera. And obviously, this can very much escalate tensions in more liberal areas. And so so they are very interested in de-escalation skills, civil dialogue skills, and communication skills. Of course, couched in kind of Christian language and Christian paradigm, but that's what resonates with them. And they're very interested in promoting an overall environment of safety so that people from their respective congregations can come to an event and feel safe going to the event, right? Because if people don't feel safe going to a public event and no one shows up to the event, and then it's impossible to coordinate for some kind of collective action, right? Because no one wants to show up if if only 5 people show up, and then Antifa or another group comes and then intimidates you, and then basically the whole protest will fall apart. So building an environment of safety and trust, and also dealing with intra-group polarization and intra-group divisions, right? So a lot of times when we think about depolarization, we think about bringing groups of different sides together. But I think that there's a lot of work to be done with working with the polarization within a group. And so some of my activist friends, my left-wing activist friends in Portland, talk about how when groups are internally polarized, the likelihood that violence breaks out, let's say in a protest, actually goes up, right? People are not staying together, there's less trust on one side, and they actually become more violent. And I've always had a question about this, like if there is a group with a problematic ideology, is it good to actually break them up into more granular silos? Or is some level of cohesion actually better? And it actually turns out the latter. The research shows that the latter is actually the case. And so working with intra-group polarization is a great way to start working with people who have an incentive to not have their own group fall apart. So there's more of a natural incentive to use communication skills, to use dialogue, and to kind of humanize people on your own side first. And also what that does is it breaks up the groupthink that might be occurring in a certain group, right? You get everyone to kind of start thinking independently. And what the research shows, and I've definitely experienced this, is when you work with intra-group polarization first, if you do want to bring that group with a group from another side, the dialogue goes way better. You kind of soften things up and create that internal cohesion on both sides, and then you bring the sides together, and it usually goes a lot better, right? So working with intra-group polarization I found to be a great opportunity, assessing the incentive landscape and seeing where the energy and motivation is, and then feeding that on people's own terms, talking to people on their own turf, using their own language, and kind of respecting their ideological framework or worldview that they're in. So these are all the things that I've been doing to find credible messengers and build relationships with diverse community partners. I think in today's age with the our media bubbles and social media echo chambers, it's so easy to get stuck in a bubble, right? We get information from the same sources. There's a kind of insulating feedback loop effect going on. And so what I'm hoping to do more is to kind of train people to be cultural ambassadors, right? To be able to use these skills to go into different communities and work with them on their own terms. And sometimes this means I do it implicitly, which means I'm not always upfront about the project right off the bat or what I'm doing, because I would appear too much like an outsider. So I approach the community kind of as an insider and build friends, be friendly with them and build a personal relationship first. And then I can introduce the project more explicitly later on. But doing that right off the bat, I got shut down so many times. I had to kind of adjust. And there are ways of working with communities implicitly where they don't necessarily know of my role, but I'm just working with what they're already doing. So I'm not trying to inject anything or impose anything on them. I'm not trying to plant seeds or anything, right? I think there's a little bit of an ethical issue there. But just being able to help feed the things that are already moving towards nonviolence, and then potentially challenge or very subtly disrupt things that are moving towards violence. And my hope is that through building all of these bridges and interconnections between siloed aspects of society, then there'll be less otherization, there'll be more mutual understanding, and we can still disagree, right? We always will have disagreements. The democracy depends on disagreement and differences in perspective and opinion. That's fine. But it's the otherization and dehumanization of others who hold the opposite views is a problem. And I'm hoping that, you know, this kind of work can move towards a more integrative society where that doesn't happen, right? We can disagree and respect each other in that disagreement. So working upstream or downstream from polarization to violent extremism and addressing the climate of polarization to prevent violent extremism from even coming up as a thing is a lot of the work that I'm doing. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. And now I'd like to introduce our final panelist, Juan Camilo. Juan has worked for more than 15 years with excluded and vulnerable populations in civil society and public sector roles in Colombia and the UK, especially on issues of social and economic inclusion and violence reduction. He's currently the executive director of Fundación Alvaralice, an NGO based in Cali, working to promote peace and improve opportunities for young people. So Juan, your organization's Opening Roads, Communities, Saving Lives project reduces violence in urban contexts and transforms the lives of youth in really vulnerable situations. Can you please talk to us about how the project participates, especially how project participants, especially youth, are receptive to a nonviolent approach to security?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'll start off by giving you a bit of context. So we're based in Cali, which is Colombia's third largest city. It's a city with a population of around 2.5 million people. And it's probably at the moment the city of Colombia that has the highest number of homicides amongst the large cities. So last year we had 1,200 homicides, which is down from almost 2,000 homicides around 8 years ago, but which is still very, very high and still places us amongst the 50 cities in the world with the highest number with the highest homicide rate. And this violence is very much concentrated in areas of the city that are deprived areas, which have the highest levels of poverty, least opportunities. So it's very much the deprived areas that concentrate this violence, and very much concentrated amongst young men as well. And there's not that many projects that tackle violence straight on, so it's very much as usual a police approach to violence generally. So about 5 years ago we started working with the Cure Violence model, which has been developed or implemented in different parts of the world, which tackles violence through 3 main strategies. One is doing mediation, early mediation, so that conflicts don't escalate and don't turn violent, and that is done by people who are close to those participating in conflicts. So in our case, people who are close to young men who are involved in gangs or in some sort of criminal activity. So it's very much credible messengers doing mediation and interruption of conflicts. A second area of work is reducing risky behaviors, and especially engaging with young people who are either involved in violence directly or at high risk of becoming involved, and trying to address risk factors. And very much these risk factors are close to opportunities. So what young people very often want to leave violence, or one of the reasons they give is that they don't have a secure source of income, so they might live off petty criminality. So we help them, for example, engage in school, finish their schooling, go into job training, or develop some sort of subsistence business, a small business in their local area, or help them deal with substance abuse. And there's a third line of work, which is working with the whole community, and that is about changing social norms that in one way or another justify violence or normalize violence in some of these areas. So we do community events where people reflect and they try to change attitudes towards violence. And we've been doing this for 5 years now. And in some of these areas, violence is quite complex because you have the presence of organized crime, but there's also a lot of inter-community violence. So young people who join small groups, we call them gangs here, but it's not like the large Central American gangs. It tend to be groups of 8 to 10 young people, very much localized, and as a way of self-defense or very territorial, they face off with other groups of young people in their areas. And there's also a lot of just violence amongst neighbors, or even within families. And often, like, these different sources of violence, they interact within the same areas. There's a widespread availability of guns, which also makes conflicts potentially lethal. And then there's the relationship with the police, which is often complicated. There's high levels of impunity. So only the clearance rate for homicides is 25%. Only 1 out of every 4 homicides ever advances in an investigation. People very often don't trust their local police, and in some cases, people perceive the police as being involved with criminality, or at least being passive with criminals. So what this project helps to do is try to help communities to diffuse violence within their areas, or to at least mitigate the impact of violence on communities that are not involved in criminality anyway. In terms of the response of young people, it's usually positive. It's not just young people. I mean, generally in the community, because this violence ends up affecting everybody, and so people end up not using, for example, public spaces. People end up not feeling safe when they're walking around their neighborhood. You get areas where deliveries won't go in, so people can't order food or medicines to be taken to their homes because delivery people won't go in because they're scared to do so, or public transport won't go in. And so when we start working around this, so it's not just the reduction of homicides that we get, and especially we get a reduction in retaliations, homicides caused by retaliations, but there's also a big change in terms of young people that find an option outside of violence and criminality, but also a change within the community. And some of the results that we've had is, for example, taxis going back into neighborhoods where they didn't used to go, or deliveries coming back into those neighborhoods again. And very often the young people, I mean, what they're looking for is actually a way out of this spiral of violence from which they don't see many options. So part of what the violence interrupters do is help them connect to institutions, and help young people overcome very entrenched mistrust in institutions. So very often, especially when young people have been involved in some sort of criminality, then they're very scared to engage with institutions because they think they might be they might get picked up by police or by the justice system. So working with people who are close to them, that gives them the confidence to access services and social inclusion programs. There's also a long history and also a lot of mistrust within some of these neighborhoods, in terms of that they feel that they have been abused by institutions and projects. They see projects coming to communities and very often like stay for a short time, or say they're going to say things and do things and then not fulfill what they had promised. So that confidence building within the young people is a key area of work. And even some of the people involved in the more organized crime side of it, they support this sort of interventions as well, because very often what they say is that they don't want their own children or their nephews or their families to live through what they have lived. And very often the stories that they have to tell is that they grew amongst a group of I don't know, 20 friends, and out of those 20 friends, more than half of them might be dead. And then those remaining are probably in jail in many cases. And they don't want younger generations to live through that. So we get the support for the project, even very often from those who are driving more the criminal side of things within these neighborhoods. And often as well, they don't want attention called into their neighborhoods, because if they have some sort of I don't know, if they're selling drugs in the neighborhood, for example, having lots of homicides or gang fights in their area calls the attention of the authorities. And so there is widespread support, not just amongst young people who want to get out of that violence, but also from the wider community, and paradoxically, sometimes also as well from those more involved in criminal activities. We don't work together with the police for several reasons. The main reason is that we don't want to put in danger those who are doing the work, those who are engaging with young people, those who are doing the investigations. And so we're very careful that there won't be any accusations of snitching, which is a risk. But we very much respect that the police also has work to do. And we even think of this as a different approach of working within very violent communities that might even paradoxically help out or help the police do better their work. So just to give you a few examples, very often, because there's this mistrust with police, if you get like a community fight, if the police intervenes, very often people will end up fighting with the police, people who intervene in these local fights. So if a trained mediator, a local person mediates a fight that might be happening at a party or something, or out on the street, then that there's two things that happen. One, police don't have to get involved in small incidents, and they can concentrate their work on some of the major issues. And two, it avoids this sort of confrontation between communities and police, which are also very harmful. We've been working with this approach for 5 years now. We started off in 2 areas of the city. We did an external evaluation. We adapted the model to some of the local context, which is different to other areas where it has been used. And then last year, at the beginning of the year, we had quite a significant national strike, which led to uprisings in several cities, and probably the most affected city was Cali, and that had a big reaction from civil society. So a group of local businesses and organizations or foundations got together and developed this large initiative to work with young people at the city level, and that has allowed us to work. They're supporting our work now, and we're working in 40 areas of the city. The city has had, compared to last year, a 25% reduction in homicides, which is quite a significant reduction for 1 year. And we think that this sort of work is contributing a lot to that. So that's kind of like the summary of the work that we're doing, and I believe that nonviolent approaches to security can be very useful in areas where there is high levels of violence and high levels of mistrust with authorities and with institutions, and especially if you empower and if you work with local leaders that have the confidence within those communities. Just because they're very well placed to, on the one hand, to intervene conflicts at an early stage before they escalate and they turn violent within the neighborhoods, and because they're the best place to engage with those involved in violence, who are often those who are hardest to reach and most mistrusting in institutions. And so, yeah, so I think it's been a positive experience. It's also some of the elements of the work that we've been doing is now being incorporated into some of the wider security strategies of the city. So the cities at the moment are planning its kind of long-term security strategy. And so some elements of violence interruption, social prevention of violence are very much being incorporated into that long-term security strategy. And we're feeding into the development of that security strategy.
Great. Thank you so much, all three of you. Really appreciate your comments. And we have some time for some questions, and we have some questions in the chat. One of the questions I believe was answered. Callista is working with us in the area of advocacy and has worked in South Sudan, addressed a little bit the relationship building in different settings, including Ukraine, but we can go further into that. But I wanted to start a little more broadly. We have talked about the youth protection teams. You've also talked about the work, Juan, that you're doing with youth, and I assume, Ryan, there's also when you've encountered working with youth in this violence prevention work. And I guess I would like to start there and just talk about the importance of involving youth in this work and the impact that has on communities, and where you see tension points or where you see some of the challenges. What is that experience like to do this work with youth? Sunday, would you like to start us off? We may have lost Sunday, but Ryan, could you speak to that? Have you had much interaction with youth as you're doing your work?
Yeah, it's a funny question, because we just got another grant, and now we're looking to develop youth programs eventually down the road, because it is a huge thing. So it was so interesting to hear Sunday and Juan speak about their respective contexts, because I think there are some very big differences between kind of the Pacific Northwest context that I'm in, where ideology and polarization around ideology is a huge variable that I think is hugely contributes to polarization, and that hugely contributes to extremism. And so what I think mostly of in terms of working with youth or working with educators who want to educate youth are when we're presenting different kind of ideologies or ideas to youth, how are those ideas actually presented to them, right? And obviously this is a huge debate in the US about the kind of the culture war dynamics going on in schools. Like, what are they teaching our kids, right? Are our kids being brainwashed? What's going on with the curriculum, with the critical race theory in schools, gender ideology, and a lot of polarizations around, like, wokeism and identity politics and so forth. And so in a lot of the conservative communities that I work with, right, obviously homeschooling is very big in the Christian communities in rural Washington. And so there's a lot of homeschool groups who are very against what's being taught in these kind of liberal public schools, right? So I think this is something that I think a lot about, because there's a lot of ideas that people think are neutral ideas or just teaching facts about history, but to one side or another, this is an extremely polarizing agenda of ideological brainwashing. And so that creates a lot of problems, not only the polarization in schools, right, like school board meetings blowing up, Proud Boys or people who are armed showing up at school board meetings, or even if they're on Zoom, they're people infiltrating and blowing up Zoom school board meetings. But it goes to bigger problems where parents who don't like what's being taught to the youth just pull their kids out of the schools. And so we have more ideological polarization where all the kids who do go to the public schools learn one thing, and all the parents who homeschool or send to a private school are learning a completely different thing. And then it's very hard to have any kind of conversation later on in life, right? So my idea going forward is to present new frameworks with which to present different ideas to youth that can also make the parents kind of happier, and presenting different kinds of ideas as kind of frameworks to play with that people can consider, and taking multiple perspectives and so forth. And there's actually a lot of really good research from the university in Cambridge using something called the integrative complexity model. And so it basically, they measured two kinds of complexity of people's thinking about a certain topic. There's elaborative complexity and dialectical complexity. So elaborative complexity means how sophisticated and thoughtful and nuanced are you at articulating a single perspective. And what they found is that terrorist leaders like Osama bin Laden, very, very smart guy, very high in elaborative complexity. They could articulate one perspective very, very well, right? Probably better than I could. The youth that were least polarizing, most immune to violence or radicalization, were very high in what's called dialectical complexity, which is how good are you at elaborating multiple competing perspectives, even contradictory perspectives. So I'm doing research now. I'm working to build programs that teach people how to build dialectical complexity and integrative complexity. And once you get that going, right? The studies have showed that the chance that you drop into violence and commit violent action goes way down if you're high in integrative complexity and dialectical complexity. So I'm kind of thinking on that kind of level to address the upstream polarization, but I'm sure someone like Juan has a much more direct answer that he's done in his community.
You know, Juan, before you go, there's a little bit of a nuance here that Parfit from Burundi asks about. If you can explain kind of how a locally trained mediator can play the role between an armed young person and a police officer. So I just wanted to raise that as you talk a little bit about youth, that addressing that specific question. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Well, if the young man is armed at the moment, then it's difficult, because then the police will probably it will probably be an illegal arm, and they'll probably make an arrest. But their main job is to de-escalate a situation, and very often, so in our case, violence interrupters or mediators, they're clearly identified. They use a very distinctive blue shirt, and so people identify them within their neighborhoods, because they're local. So and they know their communities, people around them trust them and know the work that they do, and so local police also get to know them. And so when they when there's a confrontation between a police person and a young man, what they'll probably do is try to de-escalate the situation, and try for them to deal with the situation without being violent to each other. I mean, sometimes they won't be able to avoid somebody being taken to the police station, but then what we'll probably try to do is to follow up what happened to that young person once they were taken to the police station. So there's a few things there. I mean, the first one is de-escalating, trying to clear up the situation, knowing why there's the engagement between the police and the young person. And then if the young person is taken to the police station, then following up and making sure that they're treated properly and that their rights are respected, because that's often a situation that we get as well. And that's part of the difficult relationship between communities and police, is that police very often assume that young people are doing bad things, and so they will rough them up routinely and even or detain them temporarily with no justification. And so when there's an external actor, which is somebody who is trusted by the community as well, that puts on an extra pair of eyes to be vigilant to the way that the police is acting. So I mean, that also helps mitigate the risk that that sort of improper behavior might happen. I wanted to point out so our work is very focused on young people, but this is a specific challenge that we're facing, is that younger and younger kids are often getting involved in violence from very young ages. So we might have kids as young as 14 who might be using drugs, involved in petty criminality, and who might have already killed. And sometimes these young people, very young kids, they want to prove themselves in their local area amongst their friends and even other people who in the neighborhood. So they can sometimes be even more violent than other young people in the area. And the big challenge there is that very often some of the opportunities we try to find for young people to get out of violence is through income generating activities. But then of course, if you're under 18, then that's very difficult. So especially when kids under 18 have started making some money here or there, I don't know, carrying stuff between one person or another, or stealing, then looking for an option for them to replace that lost income, if you would call it that way, is very problematic, because you're working with kids who should be in school, not working, not generating an income. And I think we need to be more creative in that area in terms of how we engage with. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that one thing that we found is the need for emotional support and the fragility of a lot of these people. So behind very violent people, you often find very fragile and emotionally needed people. And so sometimes the relationship between the mediators or violence interrupters and the young people, even people who've been very violent, turns out to be very much of somebody who can listen to them. And when they feel listened to, that's something that they recognize a lot, and they are very thankful about. They often say, like, I've felt that nobody has ever listened to me and to the problems I have. So I think emotional support and that sort of emotional fragility is something that sometimes we might overlook, and it's very important in our case anyway.
Thank you so much. Sunday, if you're able to respond to the question about working with youth, and there was somebody asked, Molly asked specifically about if we've worked with youth peace teams who maybe have been previously involved in violence, about whether those individuals or help reframe masculinity for young men currently involved in various violent contexts. Are you available to speak, Sunday?
Okay. We are in different contexts, as in I can speak with the context of South Sudan, with different tribes and different perception on how men should behave, and also how did men come up to help the other gender, which is the female. It's a bit difficult at the time when we start engaging with youth, because they find some of the work and some of the things that it's more of stereotyping the other side. Also, it doesn't look good if a man can really support the other person, which is like female to one. And with more training and the engagement of building the capacity of youth, it become more easier knowing that as a man, you were in the box, and now outside of the box of trying to really question the cultural norms, because things to do with culture that are really uprooted and really deep. So it's not easier for the youth to participate in many things, because people believe with the culture, so things can't work that way. And if you want to talk also to the community, they will be like, no, that is not in the norms, and it's not even accepted, so it's going to change our culture, so on and so forth. But the time we start engaging with the youth, they come to understand the importance of trying also to question things to do with gender and how it can work, because the gender change each and every time. And also when we engage them, they also get exposed to new ideas, which we also see that when you are in one place or when you don't get that access opportunity to learn new things, so you won't be able to really think well. You just know that what is taught at the age of when you are young, that's the right thing. But when you get exposed, when you come together with people, when you learn from different people, you know actually that, oh, so maybe these things can be done this another way around, like the other person's doing. It also helps us as a team. We are in Juba because we have a diversity. We have people from different parts of the world, which also help these youth to get it. How does it mean really to be a man, and how the protections can work with all these people from different parts of the world, and how the cycle of the masculinity can be broken. It's really hard, but we all try to make them also understand how they brainstorm about this masculinity and how we can also try to put on some question that can bring people together instead of criticizing the others and also being violent because of how you are created. And yeah, it's a bit challenging at first, but now it's becoming easier for the team, as we also have these young people are also like growing, these teenagers. It's also hard when we also engage with them because they are having different ideologies, and with the context changes every day, so it also makes it hard for the youth protection teams to really have these youth convinced on how they can be moving on with the life. And like the current setting of the camp that we are in, it's becoming more hostile like before. And also the youth who are within here, they are also becoming some they understand, and the others also at some point they start questioning the life which they are going through, in which we also don't give them the right answer, because there's the situation of the country does not give people that hope to really see the future and how they will be good. But youth are really trying hard to figure out and make also the other youth to understand the importance of how they can be living. I hope I give the answer.
Oh, thank you so much, Sunday. Really appreciate that. I want to point out a couple of comments and things that people have said. First of all, someone is asking about any writings that maybe, Ryan, you've done on breaching divisions and any resources. So we should make sure that we know how people can access those resources at the end of this. Anne Frisch has also mentioned the possibility of funding through Rotary clubs. So if you haven't looked into that, that might be an option. She has put her email address in the chat to assist. And then Kalista also asked a question. I think, Ryan, it's mostly directed at you about the role of neutrality in your work. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's a great question. And obviously with the mediation background and mediation centers, this is a huge subject of debate. What is neutrality and is it possible? And so I'm of the opinion that I don't believe, so actually, I'll just start by saying in my mediation center, we actually stopped using the word neutrality. We say impartiality or being impartial. And some people have started talking about this concept of omnipartiality. Right, so instead of being neutral and objective, right, and that's pretty much impossible to do in today's climate, and given that we have biases of all kinds too, maybe we should reframe that to being omnipartial, which means that we're partial towards everyone, right? We're partial towards all parties in the conflict, and I have found that to be a very helpful reframe with some of the work that I'm doing with these different rural communities where. As I like to say, I do have an agenda, right? I'm for peace and nonviolence. But in terms of the actual ideology and the things that you particularly believe, as long as it's peaceful and nonviolence and not otherizing people, then I'm okay with it, right? So in that sense, I am kind of omni-partial in helping each community or talking through with them, kind of finding the narratives to uplift, and then talking more about those on their own terms, right? So if it's biblical passages with certain Christian groups, if it has to do with different kind of anarchist talking points with left or right groups, right? Like a lot of anarchist communities emphasize de-escalation and mediation skills, because if you don't have the state to come in with force to adjudicate a conflict, the community has to be equipped with the mediation and de-escalation skills to be self-sufficient in managing conflict on their own in order to have a kind of anarchist commune, right? So looking for the narratives and ideological openings and feeding those on their own terms. So in that sense, in that moment, I am very partial, kind of on that side in a way, and kind of identifying as a kind of community member. But I do have an agenda moving towards peace and nonviolence. So, and I think too, again, going back to what I said at the beginning about just looking at our own biases and how that comes into the picture, and our own ideological biases, I think that's a big piece of it too. And this sounds like a very simple thing. Someone mentioned in the chat about like emotional intelligence, and I think the word they said was affect tolerance. And that's another big part where if someone is saying something to us that's very triggering and very disturbing, that might influence our behavior in a way that makes us take action that looks partial or that looks biased, right? So having the kind of emotional intelligence to be aware of what's coming up for you, and if someone is triggering you or annoying you, and then seeing how you would want to react to that situation, and if it escalates the situation more. So I think that's another that internal component to me has been really important, especially when dealing with communities that I really have huge disagreements with. But that to me is kind of all part of the constellation of the work and conversation around neutrality and impartiality.
Great, thank you. Looking, there was also a question about specifically on South Sudan. And it has probably more to do with how you engage with armed security actors in the different contexts that you might work in. There was one about, let's see, it's actually directed towards Sunday. We also have Kalista on, who works with Nonviolent Peaceforce in advocacy role and previously worked in South Sudan, and might be able to address this a little bit, just in terms of how we work alongside with other actors who might be armed. Do you want to take that one, Kalista?
Yes. Sorry, I had to get unmuted. Yeah, so, NP in all of its contexts definitely wants to work with all of the stakeholders, including armed actors, especially because in some cases, like if they're the state military or the police or whomever, like they are probably the duty bearers for the community's safety and have a stake in that and a role that we would want to support and encourage. So I didn't see the question written. So is the question like, do we move around with the armed actors? Do we let ourselves be seen with armed actors? Was there anything very specific, or?
The question actually has to do with the UN mission in South Sudan and how we evaluate that and how we work alongside groups like that.
Yeah, that's definitely something that NP in South Sudan has to balance. And sometimes the perception of UNMISS hasn't been great on the part of the communities. And so NP originally working in South Sudan wore light blue uniform shirts. But later, as that got to be too associated with the colors of the UN, NP switched to bright orange to really maintain our specific visibility as NP and separate from that, because it can be a tricky relationship. So we definitely in South Sudan would engage with UNMISS. It was really important to have relationships with the armed peacekeepers, because they were also responsible for security of communities and places where they're stationed. So in one of my first field sites, we would go meet with the armed peacekeepers because they didn't initially even have translators. They really didn't know what the community's challenges were. They didn't know what areas they felt unsafe in. They didn't know, they just had no connection to the community. So we were able to play a connecting role in helping to connect the peacekeepers, the armed peacekeepers, to the community and its leaders and its needs so that they could better contribute to the community's security. But other times we would really question whether we could go somewhere with UNMISS. Like if there was an area that experienced recent conflict that was hard to reach, sometimes the UN had better logistics, better vehicles, helicopters, whatever. And the question would be, should we go with them so we can reach that area and get to those people who have security needs, or is that going to hurt our credibility as Nonviolent Peace Force if we're seen with people wearing wearing the personal protective gear, carrying armed weapons, and there was sometimes when it was decided to do it, but always with a lot of evaluating the context and how that would work.
Thank you.
Did I answer the question? Was there more?
No, I think you did. Thanks. Thanks. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. One of the things that has come up as we're talking, that we're with Ukraine on our minds so much, and John has raised, how would this work in Ukraine? And Nonviolent Peace Force is the only group that's present that is doing some work in Ukraine. But I'm just curious about your thoughts, Ryan and Juan in particular, just to talk about from your perspective, how would the work that you imagine, the work of nonviolence in that sort of situation. A few years ago, when we would do these sorts of conversations, the question was usually about ISIS. So, right, when we see these extremely violent situations, where do you see nonviolence as a methodology and a tool stepping in? I don't know, Juan, if you want to say something.
I think the context we work in is very different. Perhaps what's driving a lot of the violence is economic pressure, even kind of like long-lasting cycles of inter-community violence, but it's violence amongst people who are very similar to each other, who have similar backgrounds, who live through similar experiences. It's very, very kind of like local turf wars. So it's different to a situation where there's like ideologies or ethnic lines dividing them, or religious lines dividing them. So I'm guessing that's why we put so much emphasis on stopping the violence, and not even kind of like going into the roots that divide people within the conflict, because there aren't those deep roots to address. I mean, it's even when people are fighting, like people who've grown together are fighting each other just because they end up on the wrong side of the road, or because with a different group of friends. But so there isn't like this element of nationality, religion, or even ideology. So it's more kind of like everyday violence that's being lived through. And part of what we try to do is, and I guess that's where it might be common to others, it's try to address how those involved in that violence are justifying it to themselves. And in this case, it's often like, oh, I'm being attacked by them, or if I need to defend myself, or I need to earn a living. If I don't go out and steal, then I'll be hungry. And so it's kind of addressing those issues and getting people to reflect on what's driving them to be violent, and trying to address those personal kind of like justifications they have for themselves. That might be similar to others, but in terms of those big dividing lines, I don't think, and that it's paradoxical that we don't have them. So yeah.
Ryan, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'll be brief on this one too, because like Juan said, my context is so different than what's going on in Ukraine, and I'm not an expert on Eastern European geopolitics or what's going on the ground there. But one thing I'll just add that I think about a lot is that, you know, even if Vladimir Putin decides to stop the invasion today, who knows how much kind of generational trauma and stuff has come up as a result of the invasion and the war. And I think what Juan was saying, like looking at the grievances of the community and the kind of narratives that have, in this case, cropped up due to the invasion, and kind of working with that. And just one example is I was working with a group that was addressing the white supremacist shooting in Buffalo, and working with the local community that suffered from the shooting and all of the trauma for people who had family or friends who were killed in that supermarket. And I think that's a really important place to intervene in starting to create healing for the community, so that violence is not perpetuated down the road, right? So that that resentment and anger is not passed on to their children and grandchildren, and then you get stuck in a cycle of violence that this goes on for, you know, millennia. So I think there may not be a lot that can be done to really stop the war if the authoritarian dictator is just like sending the military in. But I think that working with the communities who have experienced the trauma and damage from the war could help to pave the road for healing, you know, down the road or in the future.
I would just reiterate that what you're saying, Ryan, and building on the work that Nonviolent Peaceforce does is really community-based, and it's working with local communities to help solve their own issues and problems. And in Ukraine, our team is doing just that now, finding volunteer networks that are responding to the violence and supporting one another and keeping one another safe, and building on those strengths and those capacities to help protect civilians in that situation. See if there's any. So Charles had asked if we could talk a little bit more about nonviolence NP's approach during violence. Is a Sunday or a Callista, would either of you like to address that? I just did a little bit, but.
I can. I don't know if Sunday wants to as well, but it depends what you mean, like how specific you mean during violence. If it's like the machine guns are shooting, the rocket grenade launchers are going, like we're in the bunker, we're in the foxhole, you know, we're not out there as like bullets are actually flying, because if we're not safe, we can't help anyone else be safe either. But if it's, you know, coming into a community that has just experienced violence within hours or days, as soon as we can safely get there, if we're not already in there with them, then it's a lot. NP does a lot of work of helping the most vulnerable in a community access services if there are any available. So I know in Ukraine right now, the Ukraine team is doing a lot of like mapping to see like places where maybe and this has happened in other country programs too, where a family had to flee the violence, but they had to leave a disabled elderly relative in their home, and the NP team can help get in there safely to help evacuate the infirm person who got left behind. Or there's elderly people who were not able to evacuate in Ukraine in conflict areas, who aren't able to access their medicines because those health services are gone. So NP can help make connections between that and help the people who are still stuck in those areas experiencing violent conflict, to help them meet their needs and in some cases be safer. NP in Ukraine is also working with at some of the transit sites where civilians are trying to evacuate out of the country, because that's a very vulnerable time, and trafficking is a real threat. So they're helping to, the team is helping to connect with people who are involved in that, seeing who's are people following the like safety procedures that can help keep people from becoming victims of trafficking when they're experiencing that. I'm trying to think some other examples, but maybe we don't have time.
Yeah, that's okay. I just want to end with one question, particularly for Ryan and Juan. I'd just like to hear you talk about what gives you hope in your work.
But one thing that gives me hope is I mean, every single case we see of somebody who was very much going towards violent end to their lives, find a different option for their lives. They become examples for other people locally. It gives me hope every time we talk to a mediator and we hear a story from them where they've been able to do a successful mediation of a conflict that was a very high risk conflict. It gives me hope when you been to a neighborhood where people aren't outside because they're afraid to be outside, and when you see them again using the streets and children playing out in the street, that gives me hope. All of these things don't always happen. We have a mix of hope and also setbacks, but it's always very, very useful, I think, to focus on the good cases and not let those setbacks kind of like set your mood, because otherwise it becomes very difficult to do this work. I mean, that's why we're there, because they are very violent neighborhoods, and that's why we do this work.
Yeah. It is hard to have hope sometimes, and a lot of days I find myself in a really pessimistic attitude with the state of affairs in the US. But what gives me a lot of hope, there are a couple of things. One is just seeing the amount of support and enthusiasm from the public for our project, and people really waking up to see how dire the situation is in regards to polarization and the justification of political violence, and people really wanting to make a difference, to donate, to look at themselves, to look at their social networks and build diverse friendships and escape the bubble. And just to see the kind of community that's rallying around this effort has been really inspiring. And the second thing is it goes back to the youth, as we're talking about, right? Kind of a theme for this meeting. And seeing young people, high schoolers, Gen Z, and college students who really are concerned about what's going on, and they don't want to contribute to this otherization, polarization, demonization, violence spiral. And as Marna was saying in my intro, I facilitate for a program called Civic Synergy, which gets college students of different backgrounds together from all over the US to create bipartisan policy solutions. And they learn mediation facilitation skills and use those skills to collaborate towards some kind of synthesis policy position that integrates the various interests and ideological insights. And so just the fact that there's so much demand for this, and that there's a wave of young people who are seeing this as a problem and don't want to contribute to it and want to make America a less polarized, more integrative place, that gives me a lot of hope and inspiration. So yeah, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you, Sunday, Ryan, and Juan, and Calista for jumping in. Our special issue with Peace Science Digest asks us to reflect on what it might take for everyone to live free of fear and full of dignity. What would it look like to create a world where we and our local and global neighbors feel safe and secure in our daily lives? So I really want to thank our panelists today for sharing with us concrete examples that we can all learn from. We invite you to explore more and support the work of their incredible organizations. And you can see the links in the chat for how to do so and to connect with Nonviolent Peaceforce. And so attendees and everybody, thanks for taking the time today. You're all part of this paradigm shift from a world of militarism and violence to one of relationships and community care. As I mentioned earlier, the talk is recorded and will be added to YouTube and distributed shortly after we end the event. So you will be able to share it with others and encourage others, engage with people about this conversation to help imagine a different world where we are not looking at security through force and threat of force, but rather through community and love and relationships. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you all being here today.